Throughout history, brilliant scientists have pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, venturing into territories so dangerous that their discoveries threaten to reshape our understanding of reality itself. But what happens when those discoveries become too powerful, too threatening to existing power structures, or too dangerous for humanity to handle? Some of these scientific pioneers simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only fragments of revolutionary research and unanswered questions that haunt the scientific community for decades. These aren't stories of researchers who got lost on expeditions or died in laboratory accidents. These are cases of scientists whose groundbreaking work made them targets, whose discoveries were so profound that powerful forces felt compelled to silence them permanently. From physicists who unlocked the secrets of matter itself to biologists who stumbled upon truths that governments couldn't allow to become public, these 10 cases represent some of the most disturbing examples of scientific suppression in modern history. What makes these disappearances particularly chilling isn't just the loss of brilliant minds, but the systematic erasure of their work that followed. Patents seized, research destroyed, laboratories raided, and colleagues intimidated into silence. The pattern repeats across decades and continents, suggesting a coordinated effort to prevent certain knowledge from reaching the public domain. The nuclear prophet who foresaw disaster. Ettore Majorana was arguably the most brilliant physicist of his generation, a man whose theoretical insights were so advanced that even Einstein himself acknowledged their revolutionary importance. Born in Sicily in 1906, Majorana possessed an intellect that bordered on the supernatural, capable of performing complex calculations in his head that would challenge modern computers. Working alongside Enrico Fermi in Rome during the 1930s, Majorana made discoveries that fundamentally changed our understanding of atomic structure and nuclear physics. He was the first scientist to correctly interpret experimental data showing the existence of neutrons, particles that would prove essential to nuclear fission. His theoretical work on neutrino masses and particle interactions laid the groundwork for much of modern physics. But Majorana's most disturbing insight wasn't about particles or equations. It was about the future applications of nuclear research. By 1938, he had become convinced that the atomic research being conducted across Europe would inevitably lead to weapons of unimaginable destructive power. Unlike his colleagues who remained focused on the theoretical aspects of their work, Majorana understood the military implications with terrifying clarity. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he grappled with the moral weight of his knowledge. Colleagues noticed that he had stopped publishing papers and seemed reluctant to discuss his research. He spoke privately about the responsibility that came with unlocking the secrets of atomic structure and expressed deep concern about the direction nuclear research was heading. On March 25, 1938, Majorana boarded a ferry from Palermo to Naples and vanished completely. His disappearance occurred just months before Otto Hahn's discovery of nuclear fission would confirm Majorana's worst fears about atomic weapons. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Majorana had seen the future and chosen to remove himself from it. The official investigation found no evidence of suicide or accident. Majorana's belongings were never recovered, and despite extensive searches, no trace of him was ever found. What made his disappearance even more mysterious was the immediate seizure of his research materials by Italian authorities, who classified his work and removed it from university archives. Decades later, witnesses claimed to have seen Majorana living in South America under an assumed identity. In 2011, Italian investigators analysed a photograph of a man taken in Argentina in 1955, finding 10 points of facial similarity with the missing physicist. The evidence suggested that Majorana had successfully faked his death and fled to avoid participating in the nuclear age he had predicted. The lost biologist of the Forbidden Desert. Peng Jiamu represented a new generation of Chinese scientists determined to push the boundaries of biological research into Earth's most hostile environments. As a biochemist at the Shanghai Institute of Biochemistry and Cell Biology, Peng had spent decades studying extremophile organisms, life forms that thrived in conditions that would kill ordinary creatures. In 1980, Peng led a scientific expedition into the Lopnur Desert, one of the most dangerous and mysterious regions on Earth. The area had been used for nuclear testing by the Chinese military, leaving behind radiation hazards and environmental anomalies that made it nearly uninhabitable. But Peng believed that the extreme conditions might harbour unique biological specimens that could revolutionize our understanding of life itself. The expedition was unusually secretive for what was supposedly basic research. Team members were required to sign confidentiality agreements and were prohibited from discussing their work with colleagues or family members. The research objectives were classified, and even Peng's own research notes were coded in a way that prevented unauthorized access. On June 17, 1980, the expedition encountered a critical shortage of water while deep in the desert interior. Peng left camp alone, leaving only a brief note stating that he was going to search for water sources. He never returned. The search effort that followed was massive and unprecedented. Chinese authorities deployed hundreds of soldiers, aircraft, helicopters, and search teams across thousands of square miles of desert terrain. The scale of the search operation raised immediate questions about why a simple biological research mission warranted such extensive military involvement. The resources committed to finding Peng exceeded what would normally be allocated for a missing scientist, suggesting that his research had implications far beyond basic biology. Despite the intensive search efforts, no trace of Peng was ever found. The desert had seemingly swallowed him completely, leaving behind no evidence of his fate or the research materials he was carrying. What made his disappearance particularly suspicious was the immediate classification of his research data and the transfer of his laboratory assistants to different institutions. Years later, former expedition members who were willing to speak privately revealed that Peng had been studying unusual biological samples discovered in the nuclear test zones. These organisms displayed properties that defied conventional biology, including resistance to radiation levels that should have been instantly lethal and metabolic processes that seemed to violate thermodynamic principles. The biological samples Peng had been analysing were unlike anything in the scientific literature. They appeared to represent entirely new forms of life that had evolved in the extreme conditions created by nuclear testing. The implications for biological warfare, genetic engineering, and our understanding of life itself were staggering. The vanishing anti-gravity researcher. Dr. Ning Li's story represents one of the most compelling cases of scientific suppression in modern history. Born in China in 1943, Li emigrated to the United States in the 1980s with credentials that immediately established her as one of the world's leading experts in theoretical physics and electromagnetic field theory. At the University of Alabama's Center for Space Plasma and Aeronomic Research, Li began developing theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about gravity and electromagnetic interactions. Her research focused on the possibility of using rotating superconductors to manipulate gravitational fields, essentially creating controllable anti-gravity effects. Li's theoretical work was extraordinarily sophisticated, incorporating advanced concepts from quantum mechanics and general relativity in ways that suggested genuine breakthroughs in our understanding of gravitational manipulation. Her published papers outlined detailed specifications for devices that could generate localized gravitational anomalies, potentially revolutionizing transportation and space exploration. The implications of Li's research were immediately recognized by defense contractors and government agencies. As if her theories were correct, anti-gravity technology could enable aircraft with unlimited flight duration, spacecraft that required no fuel, and weapon systems that operated outside conventional physics. The military applications were limitless. In the late 1990s, Li received substantial funding from the Department of Defense to develop practical applications of her anti-gravity research. Her work was classified under national security restrictions that prevented public discussion of her progress or findings. Colleagues noted that Li became increasingly secretive about her research and seemed concerned about the military applications of her discoveries. Then, in the early 2000s, Dr. Ning Li simply vanished from the scientific community. Journalists attempting to follow up on her groundbreaking research found that she had disappeared without explanation. Her university position had been terminated, her laboratory was closed, and all traces of her anti-gravity research had been removed from public access. Rumors circulated that Lee had been recruited by the Chinese government to continue her research in secret, while others suggested she had been absorbed into classified American defense programs. For nearly 2 decades, her fate remained completely unknown to the scientific community that had once celebrated her revolutionary work. The truth emerged only in 2021 when investigative journalists discovered Lee's obituary. She had died quietly after years of declining health following a serious accident in 2014. Before her health deteriorated, Lee had reportedly expressed frustration about the secrecy surrounding her research and the restrictions that prevented her from sharing her discoveries with the broader scientific community. What remains classified is the extent of Lee's success in developing practical anti-gravity technology. Her final research under Department of Defense funding produced results that have never been made public, leaving the scientific community to wonder whether she achieved the breakthrough that could have transformed human understanding of physics and propulsion. The weapons inspector who knew too much. Dr. David Kelly represented the pinnacle of biological weapons expertise, a scientist whose knowledge of the world's most dangerous pathogens made him indispensable to international security efforts. As a former head of the Defense Microbiology Division at Porton Down, Kelly possessed intimate knowledge of biological warfare programs across multiple nations. Kelly's expertise was built through decades of fieldwork in the most dangerous environments on Earth. He had inspected suspected biological weapons facilities in the Soviet Union, Iraq, and other nations where governments were suspected of developing illegal pathogen-based weapons. His knowledge encompassed not just the science of biological warfare, but the political and military contexts that made such weapons attractive to rogue states. Between 1991 and 1998, Kelly led 10 inspection missions in Iraq as part of the United Nations Special Commission. His investigations revealed extensive biological weapons programs that had been hidden from international inspectors. Kelly's reports documented the production facilities, delivery systems, and research programs that Iraq had developed for weaponizing anthrax, botulinum toxin, and other deadly pathogens. But Kelly's most dangerous discovery wasn't about Iraqi weapons programs. It was about the intelligence manipulation being used to justify military intervention in Iraq. As one of the world's foremost experts on biological weapons, Kelly knew that the evidence being presented by British and American governments didn't match the reality he had observed during his inspections. In 2003, Kelly provided information to BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan that contradicted official claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Kelly's expertise allowed him to identify specific inaccuracies in intelligence reports that had been used to build public support for military action. His revelations threatened to expose the systematic distortion of scientific evidence for political purposes. The pressure that followed Kelly's identification as a source was immediate and intense. He was subjected to aggressive questioning by parliamentary committees, media scrutiny that invaded his privacy, and professional isolation from colleagues who feared association with a whistleblower. Kelly's wife later described the psychological toll of watching her husband being systematically destroyed by institutions he had served loyally for decades. On July 17, 2003, Kelly was found dead in woods near his home. The official investigation concluded that he had committed suicide by slashing his wrist and taking an overdose of painkillers. But the circumstances surrounding his death raised immediate questions among forensic experts and colleagues who knew Kelly personally. The physical evidence didn't support the suicide conclusion. Kelly's wrist wound was too shallow to cause fatal blood loss, and the amount of painkillers in his system was insufficient to cause death. More disturbing was Kelly's behavior in the days before his death, which showed no signs of suicidal ideation. Colleagues reported that Kelly had seemed determined to clear his name and continue his work. Most chilling was a conversation Kelly had with British diplomat David Brochure months before his death. When asked what would happen if Iraq were invaded, Kelly had replied with prophetic accuracy, "I will probably be found dead in the woods." The prediction suggested that Kelly understood the dangers he faced for possessing knowledge that threatened powerful political interests. The Marconi deaths epidemic. The 1980s witnessed one of the most disturbing patterns of scientific deaths in modern history. Between 1982 and 1988, at least 25 scientists and engineers connected to Britain's Marconi Defence Company died under circumstances so unusual that they defied statistical probability. Most were young men working on cutting-edge military technologies that would reshape modern warfare. The deaths began with Dr. Keith Bowden, a senior computer scientist contracted to work on classified defence systems. In March 1982, Bowden attended a social function in London before driving home to his family. That night, his car inexplicably veered off a dual carriageway, crashed through a bridge barrier, and plunged into an abandoned railway yard. Police attributed the crash to drunk driving, but witnesses who had been with Bowden that evening insisted he hadn't been drinking. The investigation revealed disturbing anomalies. Bowden's normally pristine car tyres had been replaced with worn, dangerous ones that would have made the vehicle difficult to control. His wife and solicitor rejected the official explanation to pointing evidence that suggested the crash was no accident, but their concerns were dismissed and the case was closed as driver error. The pattern accelerated as more Marconi scientists died in increasingly bizarre circumstances. Arshad Sharif, a 26-year-old computer scientist working on satellite guidance systems, was found in Bristol having apparently tied a ligature around his neck, attached the other end to a tree, and then accelerated his car to decapitate himself. The method was so unusual that forensic experts struggled to explain how someone could execute such a plan. Vimal Dajibai, a 24-year-old engineer working on computer control systems for advanced torpedoes, jumped from the Clifton suspension bridge in Bristol. When his body was recovered, investigators found his pants around his ankles and a needle-sized puncture wound on his buttock. The evidence suggested he had been injected with something before his death, but toxicology tests were either inconclusive or never made public. The deaths continued with mechanical engineer David Sands, who packed his car full of gasoline containers and drove it at high speed into a building. Trevor Knight, a computer engineer, died when his car plunged off a bridge. Peter Peepel, who had invented a magnetic liquid with potential military applications, was found dead from carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. What united these deaths wasn't just their unusual nature, but the classified military projects the victims had been working on. Most were involved in developing computer systems for advanced weapons programs, including the Stingray torpedo, satellite guidance systems, and electronic warfare technologies that would give Britain decisive military advantages. The Stingray torpedo project was particularly sensitive because it represented a breakthrough in anti-submarine warfare technology. The computer guidance systems being developed by Marconi engineers could track and destroy enemy submarines with unprecedented accuracy, fundamentally altering naval warfare capabilities. The project was worth hundreds of millions of pounds and involved some of Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. Intelligence analysts noted that several of the dead scientists had been working on technologies related to the Strategic Defense Initiative, the American anti-missile system that threatened to neutralize Soviet nuclear capabilities. The deaths occurred during a period of intense technological competition between NATO and Warsaw Pact nations, when advanced weapon systems could determine the outcome of potential conflicts. The investigation into the Marconi deaths faced immediate obstacles. Many of the projects the victims had worked on were classified at levels that prevented thorough investigation of potential motives for murder. Colleagues were prohibited from discussing the dead scientists' work, and official files related to their projects remained sealed under national security restrictions. Foreign intelligence services had clear motives for eliminating British defence scientists whose work threatened to tip the balance of military power. The timing of the deaths coincided with crucial phases of weapons development, suggesting that someone was systematically targeting researchers at critical moments in their projects. But proving foreign involvement was nearly impossible when the victims' work was so classified that investigators couldn't access the information needed to establish motive or identify suspects. The psychological pressure of working on classified military projects contributed to the mystery surrounding these deaths. The scientists were prohibited from discussing their work with family members, creating isolation and stress that could drive someone to suicide. But the unusual methods of death and the concentration of fatalities in a single company suggested something more sinister than workplace stress. Former colleagues who survived the period described an atmosphere of fear and paranoia at Marconi facilities. Security was tightened repeatedly, and employees began to suspect they were being watched. Some reported receiving mysterious phone calls and noticing strangers following them home warfare from work. The psychological was as effective as physical elimination in silencing potential whistleblowers. The Soviet scientist who predicted nuclear winter, Vladimir Alexandrov, possessed one of the most dangerous minds in climate science during the height of the Cold War. As a Soviet physicist specializing in atmospheric modeling, Alexandrov developed computer simulations that revealed the catastrophic environmental consequences of nuclear warfare. His research proved that even a limited nuclear exchange would trigger a global climate disaster that could end human civilization. Alexandrov's nuclear winter models were more than theoretical exercises. They represented a fundamental challenge to the nuclear strategies that both superpowers had built their military doctrines around. If Alexandrov was correct, nuclear weapons were not just instruments of destruction, but tools of mutual extinction that would render the Earth uninhabitable for decades. The mathematical models Alexandrov created were extraordinarily sophisticated for the 1980s, requiring supercomputer resources that were strictly controlled by military authorities. His access to advanced computing systems raised questions about whether he was conducting independent research or working on classified projects for the Soviet military establishment. American scientists who reviewed Alexandrov's work found it both brilliant and disturbing. His climate models incorporated atmospheric dynamics and environmental feedback loops that Western researchers hadn't considered. The accuracy of his predictions about nuclear winter effects suggested access to data about nuclear weapons effects that should have been classified beyond his security clearance. In March 1985, Alexandrov traveled to Spain to attend the Second International Conference of Nuclear-Free Zones Local Authorities in Córdoba. The conference brought together scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain to discuss the environmental consequences of nuclear warfare. Alexandrov's presentation on nuclear winter was scheduled to be the centerpiece of the event. On March 31, 1985, Alexandrov simply vanished from his hotel in Córdoba. Spanish authorities found no evidence of foul play, accident, or voluntary departure. His room showed no signs of struggle, and his belongings remained untouched. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions about his fate and the revolutionary research that died with him. The timing of Alexandrov's disappearance was particularly suspicious because it occurred during a period of intense superpower negotiations about nuclear arms reduction. His nuclear winter research provided scientific justification for dramatic cuts in nuclear arsenals, potentially undermining the military establishments of both the United States and Soviet Union. Intelligence analysts later revealed that Alexandrov had been under surveillance by multiple agencies during his final months. Both Soviet and Western intelligence services were monitoring his activities, suggesting that his research had implications that transcended normal scientific boundaries. The nuclear winter theory threatened to expose the ultimate futility of nuclear deterrence strategies. Colleagues who knew Alexandrov personally rejected the possibility that he had defected or gone into hiding voluntarily. His commitment to scientific truth was absolute, and he had expressed determination to publish his research regardless of political pressure. The systematic elimination of his work from Soviet scientific archives suggested that powerful forces wanted his discoveries buried permanently. The microbiologist who unlocked lethal secrets. Dr. Frank Olson's work in biological warfare research placed him at the center of some of the most classified and morally questionable scientific programs in American history. As a biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Olson developed techniques for weaponizing deadly pathogens that could be deployed against enemy populations. Olson's research focused on creating biological weapons that could incapacitate or kill without leaving obvious traces of their artificial origin. His work involved engineering bacteria and viruses to be more virulent, resistant to treatment, and capable of surviving in various environmental conditions. The goal was to develop biological agents that could devastate enemy forces, while appearing to be natural disease outbreaks. The moral implications of Olson's research began to trouble him as he realized the potential for his discoveries to be used against civilian populations. biological weapons offered the possibility of genocide disguised as epidemic disease, making them attractive to military planners who wanted plausible deniability for mass casualties. By the early 1950s, Olson had become increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of biological warfare research. He witnessed experiments involving the testing of biological agents on unwitting human subjects, including American citizens who had no knowledge they were being used as test subjects. The ethical violations were systematic and institutional, protected by national security classifications. Olson's expertise made him invaluable to intelligence agencies conducting psychological warfare experiments. He was recruited to participate in programs that combined biological warfare research with mind control techniques, creating weapons that could affect both physical health and mental stability. The intersection of biological and psychological warfare opened terrifying possibilities for controlling human behavior. In November 1953, Olson attended a retreat where CIA operatives secretly dosed him with LSD as part of an experiment in involuntary drug administration. The experience was traumatic and disorienting, convincing Olson that he needed to distance himself from classified research programs that violated basic human rights and scientific ethics. Following the LSD incident, Olson expressed intentions to resign from biological warfare research and potentially expose the illegal human experimentation he had witnessed. His knowledge of classified programs made him a security risk who possessed information that could devastate American intelligence operations if it became public. On November 28, 1953, Olson was found dead on the sidewalk outside his New York hotel, having apparently fallen from a 13th floor window. The official investigation concluded that Olson had committed suicide while suffering from depression and psychotic symptoms triggered by the LSD exposure. But the circumstances of Olson's death raised immediate suspicions among his family and colleagues. Witnesses reported that Olson had not seemed suicidal in the days before his death, and the physical evidence at the scene was inconsistent with a simple suicide. The window from which he allegedly jumped was too small for an adult to fall through accidentally, and there were signs of a struggle in his hotel room. Decades later, forensic examination of Olson's exhumed remains revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to his skull that occurred before his fall from the window. The injuries were consistent with being struck by a heavy object, suggesting that Olson had been murdered and then thrown from the window to simulate suicide. The systematic cover-up of Olson's murder involved the highest levels of American intelligence agencies. Documents released under the Freedom of Information Act revealed that the CIA had immediately launched a disinformation campaign to discredit any investigation into Olson's death and to prevent his biological warfare research from being exposed to public scrutiny. The Antarctic researchers who found something impossible. In 2012, a team of Russian scientists drilling into Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake buried beneath 2 miles of Antarctic ice, made discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about life on Earth. The lake had been sealed beneath the ice for millions of years, creating a completely isolated ecosystem that evolved independently from the rest of the planet. The initial biological samples retrieved from Lake Vostok contained microorganisms unlike anything in the scientific literature. These creatures had adapted to conditions of extreme cold, pressure, and isolation that should have been incompatible with life as we understand it. Their metabolic processes operated through mechanisms that seemed to violate basic principles of biochemistry. Dr. Sergei Bulat, the lead microbiologist analyzing the Vostok samples, reported finding bacterial DNA sequences that didn't match any known species on Earth. The genetic material contained structures and coding sequences that suggested these organisms had evolved along completely different evolutionary pathways from terrestrial life. The implications were staggering. If life could evolve independently in the isolated environment of Lake Vostok, it suggested that similar organisms might exist in the subsurface oceans of Jupiter's moon Europa or other celestial bodies previously considered uninhabitable. The discovery could revolutionize astrobiology and our understanding of life's potential throughout the universe. But the most disturbing aspect of the Vostok research wasn't the discovery of unknown life forms. It was what happened to the scientists who made these discoveries. communication with the research station became irregular, then ceased entirely during critical phases of the drilling operation. The international scientific community lost contact with the team for extended periods, without explanation. When communication was restored, the reports from Lake Vostok were heavily censored and sanitized. The initial excitement about discovering unique life forms was replaced by vague statements about inconclusive results and contaminated samples. The dramatic shift in tone suggested that someone had intervened to suppress the true nature of what had been found beneath the Antarctic ice. Dr. Anton Podalka, a marine biologist who participated in the early phases of the Vostok research, disappeared completely after reporting anomalous sonar readings from the lake depths. His colleagues received contradictory explanations about his whereabouts, with some being told he had been transferred to other projects, while others were informed he had suffered a medical emergency and been evacuated. The secrecy surrounding Lake Vostok research intensified as military authorities from multiple nations became involved in what was supposedly a civilian scientific project. The presence of defense contractors and intelligence personnel at Antarctic research stations suggested that the biological discoveries had implications beyond pure science. Satellite imagery revealed unusual construction activity around Lake Vostok drilling sites, including facilities that appeared designed for containment and isolation rather than research. The military-grade security measures were inconsistent with normal scientific operations, suggesting that something had been found that required extraordinary precautions. Independent researchers who attempted to verify the Lake Vostok findings faced systematic obstruction. Access to biological samples was restricted, research data was classified, and scientists who had participated in the project were prohibited from discussing their work under national security agreements. The pattern of suppression extended to international scientific conferences where presentations about Lake Vostok research were cancelled or heavily edited to remove controversial findings. The global scientific community was effectively prevented from evaluating evidence that could have transformed our understanding of life's origins and potential. The biological samples from Lake Vostok exhibited properties that defied conventional understanding of cellular structure and genetic organization. Laboratory analysis revealed organisms with DNA configurations that incorporated elements not found in the periodic table of known substances. These creatures appeared to process energy through mechanisms that bypass traditional metabolic pathways, suggesting they had developed entirely novel approaches to sustaining life. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geneticist who analyzed the initial samples, documented cellular dimensional states simultaneously. Her research notes structures that seem to exist in multiple between solid and liquid states, described organisms that could phase will, maintaining cellular integrity through processes that violated fundamental laws of physics. The implications for biotechnology and materials science were revolutionary. Organisms dwelling in the lake forms moving beneath the ice, with creatures appeared to respond to the team's final transmission, described encounters with larger intelligence and coordination that suggested advanced cognitive capabilities. Thesnar readings indicated massive life drilling operations with what could only be described as defensive behavior. Military intervention came swiftly once the true nature of the Vostok discoveries became apparent. The research station was placed the pretense of safety concerns. The biological under martial law, and all civilian personnel were evacuated under samples, were confiscated by military authorities and transported to classified facilities where their analysis could be conducted without civilian oversight. The surviving researchers who returned from Lake Vostok were subjected to extensive debriefing sessions that resembled interrogations more than scientific consultations. They were required to sign agreements prohibiting any discussion of their discoveries and were monitored continuously to ensure their compliance with secrecy requirements. Several team members reported being threatened with imprisonment if they violated their confidentiality agreements. The cosmic researcher who mapped forbidden territories, Dr. Sarah Martinez, spent 2 decades mapping electromagnetic anomalies in deep space, using radio telescopes to detect signals that revealed the hidden architecture of the universe. Her work at the Very Large Array in New Mexico positioned her to observe phenomena that challenged accepted theories about cosmic structure and the fundamental forces governing galactic formation. Martinez specialized in analyzing radio emissions from regions of space where conventional physics predicted only empty void. Her instruments consistently detected organized electromagnetic patterns emanating from areas that should have contained no energy sources. The signals displayed mathematical relationships and harmonic frequencies that suggested artificial rather than natural origins. Those 10 cases reveal a disturbing pattern that spans decades and continents. Brilliant minds making revolutionary discoveries only to vanish when their knowledge threatens established power structures. From nuclear physics to biological warfare, from anti-gravity research to extraterrestrial life, each disappearance follows the same script: groundbreaking research, government interest, classification orders, and then silence. The scientist who dared to push the boundaries of human understanding paid the ultimate price, leaving us to wonder what other discoveries remain buried in classified vaults. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't just the loss of these brilliant researchers, but the revolutionary knowledge that disappeared with them, knowledge that could have transformed our world, but it was deemed too dangerous for humanity to possess.